Well, I did a podcast this morning at 8 o'clock, and I was very pleased with it. I did it early because I'm in Glencolmcille and I'm learning Irish, so I have classes to go to. I did the podcast and I was very pleased with it, and I was using a Zoom recorder. It's the one I'm using now. It's not what I'm used to. Normally I'm in my studio and I have, equipment that's in the one place all the time, and you just press the buttons and you start to record. And this is a recorder that you can bring around with you, and it's very, very good standard. And I was very happy with the podcast. But what happened when it was over, after recording for about an hour, very pleased with myself. What happened? Correct. I looked at the press record button and it wasn't on. I forgot to press the button and it didn't record a thing. Well, I wasn't too happy. And I says to myself, that's okay, because sometimes I do this anyway. Sometimes I do a podcast and I run through a few ideas, and then it's like a rehearsal. And then the ideas become very clear in your head, and then you just stop, you go away, you come back, and you begin again at the very beginning. So I usually discard one or two drafts of a podcast anyway, and so I thought, I'll do that, so there's nothing lost. I'll just come back and do it this afternoon when the lessons are over. Well, the lessons were over at 5 o'clock. Good long day. And I came back into the room and turned on the microphone, as I've just done. What's my problem now is that whatever mood I was in this morning is gone, and I can't remember. I can remember what I was talking about, but there's no point in talking if you're not feeling it. I don't do conversations or talks on this podcast out of my brain. I do them out of my heart. In Islam, they say there's 18 inches between your brain and your heart, but that it's the longest journey you'll ever make spiritually. Going down into the heart so that your consciousness lives in the heart is something that they say in the Orthodox Christian tradition. And in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, they talk about bodhicitta. They talk about the kind of love awakening in the heart. That love and compassion is a sense of, a glowing energy coming out of your heart. It's all about the heart. There's another thing they say, or they do in Islam. The word for God, Allah, it's the same word as Jesus used, and in the terrible moment on the cross, in the crucifixion, when Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? We say Eloi. I'm not too sure, is Eloi probably Hebrew, but it wasn't Hebrew that he was speaking. In that moment, Jesus was a person who spoke Aramaic, and in Aramaic he would have been saying Allah, Allahu, Allahu, Allah. This word Allah is so basic that in Islam they talk about it like if you breathe in on the first syllable, Allah, and breathe out on the second syllable, you get a real natural rhythm of breathing in, breathing out the word Allah. It's a very and lovely, simple practice of meditation. In this podcast, I've looked at a diverse amount of mantras from Buddhism to Christianity. And that's a very beautiful one in Islam. And they also say that it's like the first word of the heart. You know, if you think about the heart as this pump going in and out. Allah, Allah, Allah. Those are meditations which, if you like, bring us to a sense that there is a kind of presence. It permeates everything, is in everything, and is beyond everything. Allah. They also say that the word Allah, it contains more, if you like, than the English word God. It has a wider potentiality of meaning. Well, all I know is that the door into these things is silence. You know, we're all looking for happiness and we're all looking for meaning. We're all searching for it all the time. And silence can be a cage, you know. Silence can be an awful trap. Silence, you know, if you're in a classroom and you can't speak, or you're afraid to speak because you're intimidated, that silence is really a prison. Or if other people are speaking about you, or if you're just, you know, not confident enough to speak up, or if you don't have the language, just as simple as that, you don't have the language sometimes, and you're on your own, so there's nobody to speak to except all the people around you are speaking a different language. All those ways are ways in which silence becomes a cage. You're trapped in this cage. And then the other possibility of silence is where silence becomes a door, an opportunity. Silence becomes the opportunity because it's like you go into this space that is not a prison, even though it feels like a prison. When you go silent, you feel like you're kind of contained. But what happens is that you stop living in your head and you stop living in your mouth. I'm a terrible person for talking all the time, boring people with monologues. So I'm living in my mouth all the time. And I'm living in my head all the time. And when I go silent, I find it difficult, but then after a while I feel my body is awakening. I begin to realize that my body is conscious, or maybe to put it a better way, whatever it is that is conscious in me is embodied consciousness. It's not disembodied consciousness. I don't feel that my brain or my mind is somewhere different from my body. And even the way I used the word brain there was a mistake, because that's what scientists will now tell you, that whatever consciousness is and whatever relationship it has with your brain, which of course it has, but it's not a kind of a necessary or contingent relationship. It's not like that you can equate mindfulness with some activity in the brain. There may be some correlated activity in the brain, but one is not the other. And so, in a way, we're as mystified about consciousness as people were 1,000 years ago. It's still a mystery. And it's also a mystery that consciousness seems to be like at a split level, that there is a way of being conscious of yourself, so that one part of your mind is flowing with ideas or emotions. Sometimes it's flowing with disturbing emotions. And even as it's doing that, it's possible for another part of your mind to be aware of that in your mind. Like what? If this is all, if they find out eventually in another 1,000 years that this is all just physics, it'll still be the most astonishing computer you could ever imagine, the human being. Or there may be something to that mindfulness which is actually not physical. You know, that it's in some way it's like, I suppose metaphysical would be the word you'd use for it. You know, that it's like metaphysical. It's not quite physical. And we live in a world where there's so much physicality around us. Everything is so real all the time. We live at the surface level so much all the time that to talk about anything being metaphysical is like absurd. People would dismiss the ideas of, you know, of 100 years ago about faith or religion or gods or angels or whatever. So that's all nonsense, right? You know, Freud and psychiatry blew all that apart in the 20th century. We're modern people. We know what's going on here. You know, here's a cup of tea. It's real. I'm in a room. It's real. Don't be the sky. You may not understand what happens up there in the universe, but the scientists know what happens, and they know that even the things they don't know, they will know eventually. It's all rational. It's all to do with laws, physics, which is fine. But even with all those presumptions, nobody has taken a step near the mystery of consciousness. And consciousness is amazing in itself, that, you know, I am here and conscious that I'm here and conscious that I'm speaking to you, and you are actually listening to me a little bit later, but you're conscious. You're actually aware of yourself listening. And if you weren't 3 seconds ago, you are now, because I've mentioned it, and that's the way consciousness works. You tend to pay attention to what you get a signal about. If I said to you to be aware of your toes, you could just wriggle them and you'd become aware of them in a way that maybe 3 seconds ago you were not aware of them. You weren't thinking about your toes. And when you become aware of your toes, you're aware with your conscious mind, like where the toes are the object of your awareness, while at the same time your toes in themselves are aware. They're conscious. You can, you know, when you wriggle your toes, it's you that's wriggling, because you are your body. One of the ways that we lift off the planet into consciousness is through language. And when we stop speaking, and when we try and still the mind, you know, when we stop letting the mind race with ideas, and we do that by using a mantra or lighting a candle, we become more aware of our body, but we awaken to our own embodiment. The sense that my body is me. And that's amazing too. And then there's the whole question of silence. And I was saying this morning in the podcast that silence, I think, is the common factor between all religions. Every religion has its own rituals and its own language and its own mystery and its own myth and its own storytelling and its own, you know, kaleidoscope of compassion and deities and whatever. But everything within every religion seems to always come towards the practice of silence. And that's not a silence which becomes a prison. It's not silence where you're forced to keep your mouth shut and you're not allowed to say anything. It's a silence where you go yourself, like Like you open the door yourself of this space, this thing called silence. And even if you're forced into silence, once you get inside, it begins to grow on you. Now, this is a really, really beautiful experience. This is not mindfulness, because the problem sometimes with mindfulness is that you tend to think your way into mindfulness, you know. You tend to have an idea of what mindfulness is, and you have an idea about how to get there. And so it all becomes like busy. I do this, I do that, I do the other, and then I'm being mindful. And mindfulness almost becomes an activity in itself, rather than nothing. You see, silence is the absence of words or sound. It's not something in itself. And nothing is the absence of everything. Nothing is nothing. Nothing cannot be something, if you like. I wanted to read you a column, and it's a column I wrote during the lockdown, and it's about silence, because I think that silence is this door that you go through, no matter what religion we're speaking of. You go through this door of silence, and you begin to awaken in your body. If you just stay quiet, the minute you stay quiet, you begin to awaken in your body. So I'm conscious that I'm going to become silent for 10 minutes, and in that 10 minutes I'm actually experiencing embodiment. And what you experience in this embodiment is, it's like there's a part of yourself, the conscious part, that's not your ego. It's like yourself at another level. I think that's the first thing that you ever notice about it. It's like I'm being me. I'm sitting here being silent and being me, but it feels like a bit of you that's transcendent, a bit of you that's kind of beyond your ego. A bit of you that kind of gets a wider view. You know, it's almost like you can... It's not that you can kind of just visually or physically look out the window and see the sheep from different angles or, you know, closer up or something. It's not like an eye in the sky moving around or something. It's more... It's seeing at a different level. It's being conscious at a different level. But silence brings you into this. And there's no doubt that it does. There's nobody that doesn't have this experience. So this is available to everybody, to be silent and to experience this, if you like, bigger self. And I'm leaving just gaps in purpose to have that sense of what it is. And in Buddhism, they would say that this is a kind of an awakening. This is the deepest you, you know. It's you in the heart. It's the part of you that recognizes that what you thought was yourself, that kind of personality of you at the surface when you're talking to people, the kind of person you are, the sound of your voice, the way you go on, the ideas in your head, that actually is not real. Because it's never permanent, you know. You never have the same views today as you had yesterday. The same feelings. They're different from day to day, from year to year. You're a different person every second. So there's no continuum there. There's no kind of real self at the surface. It's when you open the door through silence, silently awaken your heart. And it feels like you're sitting in your own bigger self, like you're kind of, when you're sitting there in a Buddhist position, the lotus position or something, feels like you're aware at the level of your permanent self. And you're able to kind of contemplate your narrow little ego self as something that is not separate, but it's kind of, there's a bit of you distant from it that can watch it. Now, this is the biggest gift you could ever get in life. To feel that. And the only thing that Christianity adds to that, Islam adds to it, is the idea that in that bigger self within you is God, Allah. They say in Islam that if you walk towards God, God will run towards you. And they say that God is closer to you than your jugular vein. They're big on that sense of the heart being the very essence of your being, as in the heartbeat. And this sense that, okay, so there's a veil. I'm continuing with kind of images from Islam, but there's a veil between you and God. It's not that you have to go out into the world to find God. It's not a big journey to find God. God is already inside, and it's like there's a veil between you and God. You can't identify God because of the veil. Now, the veil is, of course, your active ego. You're talking, you're walking, you're singing, you're arguing, your anger, your joy, everything, the good and the bad that you do, the disturbing emotions and the calming emotions, everything that you would say is you on the surface. In Islam, they would say it's a veil, and it's actually hiding God from you. That is to say that you can't get at God because there's a veil between you and God. Now, God can get at you because God is already inside. God is already in every molecule of your being. You are God. It's a powerful insight comes through the Abrahamic tradition of religion, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. One single idea that the unity, that God is one single thing. There's the ground of being. There's one single presence. But that God is manifest completely in you. Now you can see why going into silence, going in the door, it can be scary. That's too big an idea. And then people run away from it. And so people sometimes live on the surface all the time. I do it all the time. I live on the surface all the time. The whole day, today, I'm talking to one person after another because I don't usually see as many people, and I'm all excited with myself and I'm talking to everybody. So I'm living yap on the surface. And then I come home here and I'm silent, and I discipline myself to be silent. And I begin to acknowledge there's a consciousness within me which is waiting to have its moment of being present. And if I'm Buddhist in this moment, then this is really just, a very deep awakening of being, of consciousness, of Buddha mind. If I'm a Christian, I will just tweak it a little bit to consider this experience transcendent, that there is an otherness to this awakened, bigger, higher self, and that this is God. Now you know that all this stuff is only language. But what's really interesting is that every religion has the same language. It has the same silence. It has the same map. So religions may appear different one from another, but in fact they're not. They're all just part of what it is to be human. If you take on board that to be human is far bigger and more mysterious than we as yet understand from science. And I'd like to share with you a little piece which I wrote, a reflection that I made maybe 2 years ago, I'm not sure when, but it was during a big lockdown. In the old days, I used to read my columns out loud before completing them, just to hear the silence between the words. It was a way of ensuring that the columns carried enough silence to pleasure the reader. But all that changed in the lockdown. The problem became one of finding stories, because I was cut off from other people. I was cut off from the people I usually wrote about. The only person I used to meet was the beloved. And we spent most of February in 2020 gazing at the bird boxes which she had attached to the trees on St. Bridget's Day. But other than birds flitting about in the cold weather, there wasn't much drama or story to write about. We uttered small cries of intimacy across the table every morning as we munched all bran and pumpkin seeds. But apart from that, we were as silent as desert monks. And when there's nothing to talk about, silence becomes a solitary confinement. The silence between musical notes is delicious. And the silence between sentences in a story can be a door into imagining. But when there are no stories, and there is nothing but silence, then there is no imagining. And at that time during the lockdown, I ended up trying to write letters to people, and because I wasn't meeting people, I was getting really intensely emotional about people. I was getting so, sincere. I didn't want to be casual. I wanted to be really meaningful. I wanted to write letters to people saying things like, thank you for your love. Somebody that I really appreciate. I realized, God, I really appreciate how good they are to me. Thank you for your love, I wrote to a friend one day, I long for your return. Your presence is like wine that comes before the grapes are even planted. That's a quote from Rumi. And I'm writing this to somebody in a postcard, and then of course I tear up the postcard. I think, well, I can't be sending that out because that's too sentimental, it's too intense. And I am a sentimental person. I remember there was a time when we used to sit together, the family, the child was young, and we'd be watching a sentimental movie on a Saturday evening, And when it came to the really intense moment, the crisis where, the tear-jerking scene, the daughter used to turn and look at me and she'd say, when are you going to cry? Because she kind of had this notion, correctly so, that, I cried easily, emotionally, like a child when I was watching movies. So I'm that kind of person. It's an overexcitement in the positive as well as the negative direction. But I would read then back over a letter. That was a kind of a way that I started to write during the lockdowns. I kind of get intensely sentimental. When I'd read back over the letter, it would make me squeamish. And I'd be worried my friend might suspect me of gorging on magic mushrooms or other hallucinogenic fungi. I'd be saying deeply personal things to somebody and they'd be reading the letter and thinking, is your man on magic mushrooms or something? Not that I would be on magic mushrooms, by the way. There are some people I notice, and it worries me, not because it's wrong, but because I'm not big enough to understand it. I hear people nowadays talking about how magic mushrooms and all sorts of other hallucinogenic chemicals are going to be the future for spiritual development. That, you take some of these things just once in a workshop and you kind of make an amazing leap forward in your spiritual awakening. And I think, I can't get my head round that, because it seems to me that it's the very ordinary embodiment of who I am, and the letting go of, inch by inch letting go of my attachments. That's how I improve. That's how I become enlightened. I can't imagine that manipulating consciousness through chemicals will ever get you there. But that's not my business. To come back to the idea of me and the beloved being together for long period during the lockdown. I remember one day I was walking with the beloved up the hills. She was ahead of me on the pathway when I imagined I was looking at a person she was before she was born. Something of her essence manifested in the frame of her body and the way she moved up the slope. I don't know if you've ever had this. This is so important for what I'm trying to talk about today in this podcast. That moment where you're looking at somebody that you love. And Rumi has a word for it, or a phrase for it. Rumi talks about, the person you were before you were born. The face you had before you were born. So it's like a koan. It's kind of a contradiction, but it's implying that there is a you that is eternal, that is not just the contingent you that changes from second to second. It's the deeper you, the bigger you. And sometimes you feel you can see that. It's like, I feel it's like when somebody says, I can see an aura around somebody, or I can see their soul, or I can see into their soul. But it's a very, very common experience. I think we have it more than we realize. I think it happens to us all the time. We don't realize it. I think there's times when we're sitting on the subway, we're sitting on the underground train, we're sitting on a bus, we're sitting in a restaurant, and we're looking at somebody who's a stranger, and we're just looking at them. Might be an old person, a young person, whatever. And we say, sometimes we say things like, I could see myself in him, or I could see myself in her. But really what you're looking at is that there's a deeper level of your consciousness that in that moment is able to embrace, recognize that other person completely. It's as if you're looking at their soul, their eternal presence. Obviously, lovers have this. Young lovers have this. in the mystery of love, in the mystery of walking down the street and going into a cafe and looking at somebody else and being smitten, being completely thrown off their feet, like their life is totally going to be transformed in this moment. How is that? What's going on? It's like they're just looking at the other person. It's just like the gaze. They're gazing at the other person. And something very deep in their soul calls out. And here's an echo from the other. They know each other. Something eternal in them knows the other. It's a very strange thing. One day, I was walking with the beloved, and she was in the hills above me, and I had this feeling that I could sense her essence. And there was one night in the garden under a full moon. I had the sensation regarding myself. I felt I was experiencing my own presence even before I was formed in the womb. So you're out alone, it's the middle of the night, there's a full moon, it's very beautiful. And again, there's something in your soul goes out and finds an echo in the moon, and it comes back to you, and you feel, I'm so awake in this moment, I'm so alive in this moment, that it must be your deepest self, not the surface ego self, but some deep self in you is actually driving the train, is actually driving the bus, is awake. I'm here now, it says. And because you can't contain it within yourself, because it's so amazingly powerful in that moment to be alive, you actually look out at the moon and you see the same thing in the moon, as if the moon over the lake and the mountain, that utter beautiful landscape, is now imbued with soul. And its soul is reaching out to you. And you're like talking to the moon. You're like having a relationship with the mountain. These are such powerful, beautiful moments, and they are available to us more than we realize. These are moments like when light shimmering through a crack in the mundane world. And I'm assured by experts that these moments are not uncommon during long periods of isolation. So like you take the Buddhists in Tibet and they're up there in the snowy mountains, in caves, in solitude, on retreat. And you take the monks in Skellig Michael and they're up there on top of the rocks with the wind and the gulls and the gannets alone. And you say, what is that about? All over the world, the deserts of Egypt, the rocks on the Atlantic coast, the mountains of Tibet, human beings moving away from other people, trying to find spaces of solitude. What's that about? Well, in terms of Buddhism, it's about mindfulness that will awaken compassion. See, the Buddhist says that everything is empty. That's one of the great things. The self is empty. It's not that the surface self doesn't exist, Of course you exist. Your partner is married to somebody. Your children have a parent. You are who you are. We know that. You have a job, maybe. You have a life. But at the surface level, that changes and doesn't have the continuity that we presume it has. And so, in that sense, it's contingent on other stuff, and it changes and changes based on your disturbing emotions or your attachments or detachments. And so, in a sense, it doesn't have a kind of a permanent, stable ground of being. It is contingent, it's changing, it's impermanent. That's the word they use. It's impermanent. Every moment, impermanent. And so, if you let go of that, the deeper self awakens. And if everything is empty, and not just, it's not just yourself, but the table is not really a table because, for other things, we call it a table. We put it together in our mind creatively as this is a table, and then that becomes the table for us. But, the dog mightn't call it a table, or an insect mightn't call it the table, and it might not be a table for them. Everything that is in the material world, it's as if it gathers itself around a meaning, or it's as if the meaning was there before it got gathered around. So meaning then becomes the most creative thing you can do in your whole life. You have to make meaning. You have to have meaning. And that the reality of things actually just gathers around your drive for meaning. But there's nothing permanent. No table, no chair, no thing, no object. And it's, again, not that they're not there, but they don't exist as sort of from their own side, sui generis. They don't exist completely and permanently on their own. They don't have self-existence. They have a contingent existence. They have a word for that, they call it shunyata. Emptiness. It's kind of emptiness. And there's a lovely phrase in some of the Tibetan books. It says that emptiness is the mother of compassion. Because, of course, if you begin to understand your own self, that you are not the center of the universe, you're not the absolute me. It's all about me. This is all about me. Well, it's not all about you. It's actually just as much about everybody else, 7 billion of us. And that's not to mention the tens of billions of other sentient beings that are sharing this moment on life on earth with us. It's not all about me. And the me that I'm talking about is not permanent anyway. So you get over the sense of me, because me is not permanent. Me is contingent. Me is dependent on, what disturbing emotions happen to be flowing through me today. And I think that you begin to love yourself more when you think of it that way, because you can forgive yourself for not being perfect, not being me in some sort of perfect and important way. You can go into a room and make a fool of yourself and walk out of it and say, sure, it doesn't matter. I'm only me. It's not that I'm important. Why would you be worried about yourself making a fool of yourself in a room, making a social faux pas? So why would you be worried about that? The only reason is because you think you're terribly important. You stop making a fuss of yourself. You actually begin to have more compassion for yourself. You allow yourself to make mistakes. When you begin to see yourself like that, you start to see other people like that. You start to see other people in a way that you can actually reach compassionately for them. because they're so like you in all their flaws. Everybody is. The fact that we aren't as important as we think we are becomes in itself a way of considering how beautiful we are and how we are all coming out of a deeper sense of self, and how it's almost like you are me and I am you. There's no separation, really. So they call it like emptiness being the mother of compassion, and that's a Buddhist way of looking at it. And in the Christian tradition, they think about it just slightly differently. So they begin to, in the Christian tradition, begin to think of it as that deeper self actually being the presence of God. Let me go back for a moment to the little story or the meditation I was doing about silence. It was during the lockdown. And one night, middle of the night, I woke up and I was in a lather of sweat worrying about a hospital appointment the following day. Like, I mean, talk about making a fuss of yourself. Talk about considering yourself to be the centre of the universe, you know, that everything had to be perfect and you had to be perfect. That's what I was doing. I was in that zone of anxiety. And I was worrying, will I get there in time? And would I find a parking space? And would I need to visit a toilet on the way? And what might the doctor say about my heart? You know, would there be terrible news? And maybe I was eating too much banana cake. Maybe the doctor would tap me belly and look at me disapprovingly and say, you'll need to lose weight, Mr. H, or you'll have another heart attack. I just got myself into a terrible anxiety. I felt like a child in the dark as I left the house the following morning. I was frightened of the silent roads because during the lockdown there was nobody travelling. The abandoned villages, the empty, unknown spaces all along the way. I stopped at a filling station halfway to Dublin. Anxiety is a great tormentor of the bladder, of course, and by then I was desperate for the toilet. I risked a coffee, and as I was coming out the door, I caught a few phrases of conversation from some other people. You marry once, and you marry someone. This was a woman now, and she was telling her friend at the seating area around the door. She was saying, you marry someone, but years later he changes and you end up living with someone different. And I thought, there's a great statement. I'll read it for you again, it's so good. This is a direct quote from what I heard. She says, talking to her friend, do you know, she says, you marry someone, but years later he changes and you end up living with someone else, someone different. I sipped me coffee in the car and I was gazing at the pair of them from a distance, and I was longing to know what they were saying or how they were concluding the narrative. But I couldn't because I was stuck in this cage of silence or isolation because of the lockdown. In the hospital, a doctor examined my chest and encouraged me to keep taking the tablets and eat less banana cake. And then, when it was over, like Cinderella, I went straight home. There was a stretch in the evening at that time, so I went into my studio and I sat gathering memories from the day, like flotsam from an ocean of silence, until a few sentences lay scattered on the page before me. The beloved appeared at the doorway. the evening light behind her, and I could sense something important had happened. "There's a blue tit in one of the boxes," she declared. It felt like a tectonic shift in the cosmos, because at last I had something to write about. A filter through which to savour the ocean of silence that people called the lockdown. And I'll always remember that moment as being an example of how small we lived during the lockdown, and yet how big we lived. We lived small because here I was trying to find things to write about and meditate on for columns in the newspaper, and I've nothing because I'm just in the one place all the time, day after day after day. Then I have to go to Dublin, and I'm completely out of my head with neurosis and anxiety because I have to go, and I'm making a fuss of myself. What would happen if I had to go to the toilet? Well, sure, nothing will happen. Don't worry about it. And so I go to Dublin, and I'm stressed out, and I see the doctor, and the doctor says you're fine, and then I go home. I go straight home because, again, there's nobody on the streets, there's nobody on the highways and byways, there's nobody on the main arteries, the big roads, back to Leitrim. And I get back home, get into my studio, there I am, and suddenly beloved is at the door. Same woman's been there this morning, same woman was there the previous day. She's there every day in the lockdown, the two of us looking at each other, not looking at each other. And there she is in the doorway, and it's like, God, I can see from her face immediately there's something hugely important to be said. There's a blue tit in one of the boxes, right? She put them up. She made them and put them up on St. Bridget's Day, and here she was at 6, 8 weeks, 10 weeks later, more, maybe 12 weeks later, and she said, there's a blue tit in one of the boxes. And it's like this is a massive change in the cosmos. This is a massive world event. It's just a little story, but it was a lens through which to realize silence. Let me try and just say this as the very last thing in this meditation. When you get a narrative, you can be in the narrative like unconsciously. You're just like living a life like the way you kind of drive the car automatically. You're not really reflecting on anything. Or you can use the narrative of what happens. And by the narrative I mean whatever is happening. When you're driving a car, you're having your dinner, you're cleaning the dishes, whatever you're doing, you can use the narrative as a lens to experience the silence. There's a dynamic between the two, between the silence and the narrative. And it's the same as I started the whole meditation about, the silence and the music, that every note comes out of silence and falls back into silence, and every sentence comes out of silence and falls back into silence, and the narrative allows us to imagine. But the imagining is like this lens into silence. And what is silence? There is no way you will figure out what silence is with your head, and there's no way you'll figure it out by listening to me. There's only one way to know silence, and that is to know it with the heart. And there is only one way to actually get there, that long journey of 18 inches from the head to the heart, as Islam says. It is the longest journey spiritually that you'll ever make. And the only way to do it is to be silent. So silence is a practice that's used in so many different religions. A foundational door that every religion uses to bring yourself into experiencing embodiment, consciousness alive in your toes and your knees and your fingertips, consciousness alive in your breathing, and sometimes consciousness so deeply alive that you're experiencing it as God being with you. And there's no way to comprehend it. It's like the ritual. It's like I go out this morning onto the grass, found the little flower, brought it back in and left it in front of a little statue of the Buddha. The physical journey out, picking the flower, bringing it in, leaving it for the Buddha, this being my physical prayer of the morning. Time to do it, 3 minutes. Ideas to develop during those 3 minutes, 0. Preparation, 0. Just do it. Does it have any meaning? No. Does not have any meaning. It is what it is. It is an embodiment. It is, if you like, a narrative made flesh. It is the Word made flesh. The Logos made flesh in my feet, wet on the dew of the grass, my fingertips together with my thumb plucking the stem of the flower, my eyes rejoicing in the yellow of the leaf as it sits in front of the little Buddha statue, as if that yellow was a nuclear explosion of love. Little ritual, little narrative, a lens into the silence. And then let the silence be the discipline. Let the silence for 10 minutes or 10 days. Silence without telephone, silence without iPhone, silence. Not in the head. When there's silence, what happens is that the music of the body begins to awaken and sing its beautiful song. I am alive. And the heart begins to sing in every beat, Allah, 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 Allah. And you begin to live with your breath and on your breath and inside your breath and outside your breath. And you just are your breath. And there's nothing to think about. There's nothing to grasp. There's no meaning to it. There's no sense of mindfulness that you can fit into it and say, I'm here. I'm mindful, I'm doing it. No. Ritual is different. Ritual is different from mindfulness because it's more like a poetry. It's more like a dance that has no meaning except just that it is being, it is happening. I'm just looking at this beautiful flower. I'm looking at this beautiful flower in the window, still there since morning. And it still looks fresh. And I don't know what that means. So I hope you enjoy. It is a cage. I said that at the beginning. I'll come back to it. Silence can be a cage. It can be a crucifixion. It can be an injustice. It can be an oppression. Silence can be a crime. against you, if it is enforced, if there are places where you cannot be silent or where you cannot speak, places where you cannot declare who you are. To silence somebody can be the most aggressive thing you can do to them. But silence can be this great door. It's like taking away the veil and experiencing your deeper self as being closer to you than your own jugular. Open the door of that silence. Let the veil of noise, anxiety, and worries, let it all fall away. Find yourself in the silence and listen and listen. The silence. Somebody once said that silence is the language of God and it cannot be translated. Thank you for being here. Bye-bye.